There's been a lot of discussion about moving the hub. Let's start with that. There were a number of different possibilities, and I think with that moving shells, some people might be confused. So lay it out for me.
So I went to the meeting last week, and they unveiled the 7 locations that they're looking at. It's important to know that, at least from Gross Smart's perspective, we've been longtime champions for building a full-service indoor transit center in Providence. The bond for this passed back in 2014, so it's been 10 years, but we haven't been able to get behind it, and we've in fact said we think it should be paused until there's been a commitment by state leaders to sustainably fund the transit service. Because without the service, a hub is of little consequence to people who use transit.
When you talk about the locations itself, do you have a preference, or is it still too early? Because the main thing they've talked about is the 195, but there are a lot more options.
There are, and so I'm less concerned about the specific location so long as it meets the requirements for running an effective transit system. I have a lot of concerns about that I-195 parcel because of its location and not being close to the places where people go. So around 15,000 people a day pass through Kennedy Plaza. 11,000 of them are getting off in Kennedy Plaza. So they're going to some place on foot in that vicinity. And in order for the transit system to really work right, it's got to be convenient, it's got to be reliable, and it's got to be frequent. And if it doesn't have those ingredients, then it's going to be a hard sell to get folks who aren't currently using the system to use it. So where you locate the hub plays an important part in that.
You've asked for a pause. What's been the response?
There's been no response. We published an open letter to the governor, the speaker, and the Senate president, and I've gone to the State House to testify against the bill that would enable RIPTA to take the next step in doing the development. And again, it's almost difficult for us to do that because we've been such a champion for building a new hub, but you've got to do first things first. And as some people say, you got to have your vegetables before you jump into dessert.
The bond was passed so many years ago. Why has it taken this long to get so specific on sites?
It's important to also recognize that when the ballot question passed, that was to authorize the state to float the bonds to make improvements to transit infrastructure statewide. When the ballot question was being sold, there was a great deal of focus on building a hub at the train station. You may remember Mike Lewis was the DOT director at that time, and so they started in on that. We actually had meetings right here in this room debating some of the finer points of that hub and the challenge of dealing with Amtrak because you're going to go over the tracks. And then there was a change, and then there was a look at different sites, and there were some that just did not make sense. And to this governor's credit, he did put a pause on a very controversial multi-hub proposal nobody thought was a good idea, and took a look at the other alternatives. And here we are now. Again, it's even a few years later, and there's been such little action.
Why has RIPTA been such a troubled agency over the years, and seemingly more just within the last couple of years?
It's long had a financial challenge. I've been doing this work for about 20 years, looking at transit, and the entire time I've been doing that, RIPTA is perpetually in a state of financial challenge. And oftentimes you hear at the State House, when you're talking to different legislators, there's the frustration. Why are they always here year after year with hat in hand? And it's because of the way that the system is funded. A big chunk of it is funded through the state's gas tax, which has been a declining source of revenue, and there's not been much of a political mandate to fix that. And so they hobble along year after year. The gas tax proceeds go down. Inflation continues to go up over the years, and that puts the squeeze on the service. And if you talk to most riders, myself included, people will say that the agency deploys their very limited resources in probably the best way possible, that move the most number of people, but it still hobbles along. We don't have the frequency that we need to have a system that really works for more people. So it's really used by, for the most part, people that don't have a choice. And if we have any aspirations to see a transit system in the state really work for the state, both for the economy, for the climate, for the people, for housing, people don't often think about the connection between transit and housing, but in terms of doing transit-oriented development, that's where you're going to be able to get the most number of housing units built in a place that is going to rely less on car traffic, which is one of the big pushbacks you hear at the local level, why people don't want more housing. They don't want the traffic and the congestion. So this really presents an opportunity, transit does, if it's deployed correctly and if it's funded properly, to incentivize a lot more housing production along key transit corridors. Like North Main Street, for example, is one place where they've got a lot of capacity to do more housing, 6-story type of buildings. That's where you're going to get the unit production. You're not going to get it because you've built another subdivision in Gloucester next to the last one that was built. And you're not going to get the yield that you need to really address the housing crisis.
It also seems good. A lot of people, every year there's a budget scramble up there, a lot of people with their hand out, and you need a champion for RIPTA. And it seems within the leadership of the General Assembly, that has been lacking over the years.
It has been. And I get the fact that there's a lot of competing interests. That's a reality. What we try to point out is when you're making investments in public transportation, you're also making investments in the housing crisis, dealing with it. You're also making investments in climate action. We have a climate plan in the state that relies on a reduced number of vehicle miles traveled, meaning car travel. And this transit master plan the state has will achieve 80% of the goal for reducing vehicle miles traveled at full implementation. Full implementation is over a 20-year time horizon, but we are not going to meet the legally mandated targets for reducing emissions without implementing the transit master plan. It's that simple.
The history of this state has been plugging the hole and then getting to the next budget year. And you always hear, RIPTA's running this huge deficit, it's getting worse, it's getting worse. And I always think the mindset is, and I talked about this on a previous program, the convention center loses money every year. We subsidize as taxpayers a lot of money there. It seems that in order to have the type of transit agency that you want in a community and all those things you described, you need to view it as an investment and not just, oh, we need to plug another budget hole. How do you convince the people who are making the decisions up there to do that?
Well, one of the ways we do it is we try to connect the dots to the other co-benefits. Because if you're doing it just on the basis of improved mobility, that's a good reason to do it, and you know that it's a public good. But when you start to look at the other co-benefits, and you realize we know as a state we have to be making investments in climate action. What does that look like? What form is that going to take? It's more renewable energy, but the transportation sector is both the single largest and the fastest growing contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So we try to sort of connect all those dots: the housing crisis, the climate crisis, mobility, equity. When I remember when the Washington Bridge was they added a lane to it some years ago, and they were also excited because it was going to save 6 minutes of travel time from the state line to Providence. And when you think about how people who use transit, it takes on average 2, 3, sometimes 4 times as long to get where you're going, and that's a function of the lack of frequency in the system and other related factors. So there's an equity issue there as well. But don't forget, in Rhode Island, one of the things that is part of our DNA is that we've got compact development patterns. We're the second most urbanized state in the country, and we've got 77% of the state's population that can walk out their front door and be at a bus stop in 10 minutes. I don't think any other state could claim that. So we've got the underlying demand for transit, but again, people are not going to use it unless it's going to be convenient, reliable, and efficient in terms of your travel time. You might remember Antonia Farzan did a piece a couple of months ago where she did an experiment. She only used transit for 1 week, and then she related the challenge of getting around. And she had to cheat right? A little bit, but then a couple of weeks later, she ran another piece where she looked at all of the elements of this transit vision, the transit master plan, and then she picked it apart and related how each of those elements would address the challenges that she faced. For example, getting east to west in Cranston, there was no crosstown service. So you'd have to go all the way up to Providence, switch, and come all the way back down to Cranston. It would take you 4 times as long, and it was just, so that's an example of how the system doesn't quite work for people today. And so if you got you got the option, you're going to make the rational choice about getting from point A to point B.
Final question. RIPTA has had an employment challenge like a lot of other places. It's hard to get teachers, it's hard to get doctors, it's hard to get firemen. And, some of that's wages, some of that's just the type of job. And then that becomes a death spiral because they were talking about cutting back some routes because they couldn't staff it. And then it's like, well, if it's not reliable, so then it goes like this.
Exactly.
How do they get out of that?
They get out of it by first and foremost having a budget that gives them flexibility. So oftentimes I've heard them say, this isn't a budget issue, it's a staffing issue. But if they don't have the flexibility to adjust their wages to compete with Amazon and UPS and school bus services, then they're going to be losing drivers. And there's another 100 of them that are approaching, they're coming right up on retirement. So it's a huge risk. They did renegotiate, the board did with the ATU, the drivers union. But they need to have that flexibility to be able to adjust as they need to retain drivers.
Where would you like to see RIPTA in a year and in 5 years?
In a year, this year, I would like to see the legislature approve H7774, which would do three things. One, it would close the $8 million budget deficit, which if they don't do that, it's going to result in service cuts. Two, it invests in driver wages so they can recruit and retain more drivers, which they need. And then three, it would make the first year investment in implementing the transit master plan. The legislature should take that step of, this plan is 4 years old at this point, and there's been very little implementation aside from what the talented team at RIPTA has been able to secure in terms of federal grants. But that's just for the capital. You can't use it for operating.
5 years?
5 years?
In 5 years?
In 5 years, I'd like to see the commitment to implementing the transit master plan really take hold and really.
That's the roadmap. Just use
that is. It's all spelled out. We've done so many places would be thrilled to have the vision in the plan already, because when all the federal money became available from the capital standpoint, there was a lot of demand. People wanted to do it, but they didn't have the plan, so they had to take the time to develop the plan. Rhode Island completed its plan in 2020. But we've got to commit to implementing it.